Hi, this is Stuart Galbraith, and welcome to the audio commentary track for Invasion of Astro-Monster, the American version of Kaiju Daisenso, which translates as The Great Giant Monster War, though the film was also known under myriad alternate titles, including Monster Zero, the original U.S. theatrical title, and Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, which for many years was the name used when it played on local television stations. Let's start by talking about the music heard under these main titles. In the original Japanese version, a rousing military march adapted from the first Godzilla by composer Akira Ifukube was replaced with a cue called Denji Capsuru, or electromagnetic capsule, written for use later in the picture. The four-note motif in this cue is identical to part of the main theme to Dai Majin, the trilogy of period fantasy films Ifukube scored the following year. Replacing the march with this cue makes dramatic sense, as it gives the opening a more ominous flavor. I'd like to take a moment to talk about the credits. Which actor do you think got top billing in the Japanese version? If you guessed Nick Adams, you'd be wrong. Akira Takarada as Fuji, or as Glenn calls him, Fuge, is top billed. One other note, Henry Saperstein, the producer of the American version, had enormous respect for special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya, as confirmed by his prominent billing here, even above that of director Ishiro Honda. In what year is Invasion of Astro-Monster set? None is mentioned in the US version, but in the Japanese cut the year is given as 1960X, indicating that the action is taking place sometime in the near future, sometime prior to 1970.
Okay, Glenn.
The voice of Fuji and a great many other characters in this American version was provided by character actor Marvin Miller, who's probably best remembered today as the voice of Robbie the Robot in Forbidden Planet and as Michael Anthony on the 1950s television series The Millionaire, in which his character delivered huge windfalls to unsuspecting citizens deemed worthy by the show's unseen title character. The voice of the Millionaire was provided by Paul Frees, who also dubbed innumerable Japanese movies, though not this one.
Speed 1,000 kilometers per second. We are on course for Planet X in the Scorpion constellation.
Incidentally, there's a fairly big goof here. We're going to a planet hidden behind Jupiter, yet the English dialogue claims Planet X is located in, quote, the Scorpion constellation, wherever that is.
Corrected speed is 0.005.
Although the citizens of Planet X, their costumes, spaceships and the like are going to be quite outlandish by American standards, the design of the P-1 and the astronauts' spacesuits is comparatively realistic. Undoubtedly, their look was influenced by NASA's two-man Project Gemini spaceflights of 1963 to 66. The first manned Gemini flight, Gemini 3, was launched on March 23, 1965, with Gus Grissom and John W. Young, while in December, the month that Invasion of Astro-Monster was released in Japan, two Gemini missions, Geminis 7 and 6A, were orbiting the Earth.
What's so funny?
You should have left your sister packed in ice.
You don't understand.
Thank you. Did you and Fuji
The
disagree?
actress playing Fuji's virginal sister is Keiko Sawai. Sawai made her screen debut 18 months earlier in Japan's #1 Braggart, a 1964 feature starring comedian Hitoshi Ueki. Several films later, she appeared with Nick Adams in Frankenstein Conquers the World as the dying patient in Adams' Hiroshima hospital.
Fuji doesn't
The
approve.
original Japanese posters for Invasion of Astro-Monster billed her as a, quote, Hope of 66, indicating that Toho was planning on giving her big roles in the coming year. And indeed, she did have prominent parts in To Somewhere, Mr. Punchy, Big Wind from Tokyo, and Come Marry Me, the latter directed by Ishiro Honda.
What does he do?
Nonetheless, after 1966, Sawai was relegated to supporting parts in program pictures and small roles in big productions like Hiroshi Inagaki's Samurai Banners. Her last film to date is Jun Fukuda's Manzai team comedy Konto 55, Outer Space Adventure, Toho's last film of the 1960s. Since then, Sawai has been active primarily in television dramas. Incidentally, Sawai's sister, Takako, was also an actress and a regular on the popular fantasy series Mirror Man.
Hey, the range is getting good. I wonder why
Tetsuo's annoyed landlady, the one who in this version cries out, is played by veteran actress Noriko Sengoku. You'd never guess from this particularly wretched dubbing that Sengoku was one of Japan's finest character actresses and a member of Akira Kurosawa's stock company of actors. Born in 1922, she appeared in most of his films from Drunken Angel in 1948, her film debut, through Record of a Living Being in 1955, most famously as the former prostitute-turned-nurse's apprentice in The Quiet Duel. She's also very good as the mother in Yasuzo Masumura's Blind Beast, and in 1995 played Ruriko Asaoka's mother in the very last Tora-san movie. Sengoku continued acting well into the 21st century. Unlike many foreign film industries, such as Italy, which for decades shot their movies silent, dubbing in the dialogue later during post-production, Japanese movies of the 1960s almost always recorded the dialogue live during production. Indeed, if you listen carefully, you can often hear the whir of the movie camera under the dialogue, even in high-profile pictures by Kurosawa, Ozu, and others. In the case of Invasion of Astro-Monster, however, Nick Adams spoke his lines in English while everyone else said theirs in Japanese. None of the actors I interviewed, including Akira Takarada, Kumi Mizuno, Yoshio Tsuchiya, and Akira Kubo, were particularly troubled by this unusual production method. They were actors, after all, and each felt that since both they and Adams were working from scripts translated into their native languages, it was, as Kumi Mizuno told me, quote, "When I saw the Americans' faces, I didn't need a translator. I could tell what was being said."
Who's taking it?
An international company.
We've just seen a great transition from outer space to a very 60s agogo set, in a scene that also introduces us to Miss Namikawa, played by cult actress Kumi Mizuno. Mizuno was born on New Year's Day, 1937, and was 28 years old when Invasion of Astro-Monster was in production. She made her screen debut in a 1957 shochiku film called Crazy Society, but spent the next dozen years at Toho, where she quickly established a strong screen persona in a wide range of films. But she's best remembered for playing femme fatales in crime films and spy movies, though she also often played the tragic sister or girlfriend in the Claire Trevor Key Largo mold. Her first movie at Toho was Seiji Maruyama's A Bridge for Us Alone, which starred Akira Kubo, with whom she was frequently paired.
Oh, you know my brother?
Constantly in demand, Mizuno worked tirelessly, appearing in up to 11 movies in a single year. She made her genre debut opposite Akira Kubo as a widowed astronaut's wife in Ishiro Honda's Gorath, and the following year gave a sexually charged performance in Honda's Matango, better known as Attack of the Mushroom People. She co-starred with Nick Adams in Frankenstein Conquers the World, and would again in The Killing Bottle. She also played Russ Tamblin's love interest in War of the Gargantuas, and appeared memorably as native girl Dio in the next Godzilla film, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. In 1964, Mizuno appeared in International Secret Police, A Keg of Gunpowder. That film was later acquired by Henry Saperstein, and Mizuno's scenes were used in Woody Allen's What's Up, Tiger Lily. She made few films after 1971, but in 2004, at the age of 67, made a very strong impression as a sultry alien invader, again named Namikawa, in Godzilla Final Wars. Of all the actresses with whom Ishiro Honda worked, Mizuno was his favorite, partly because of her ability to play what he described as, quote, westernized females, unquote, women who were, among other things, more assertive and sexual, which may help account for her cult status around the world. The familiar actor playing Dr. Sakurai is Jun Tazaki, one of Japan's most recognizable character actors. Born in 1910, Tazaki didn't enter the film business until he was almost 40 years old, but after that averaged about 10 movies a year until the Japanese film industry collapsed in the early 1970s. During the 1950s, Tazaki moved freely between Toho and Shintoho, a different studio, occasionally appearing in independent films as well as those produced at Daiei and Shochiku. He was a favorite of Masahiro Makino, appearing in dozens of that director's films, including the long-running Jirocho Sangokushi film series of the 1950s. After Shintoho's bankruptcy, Tazaki spent the next several years almost exclusively at Toho. Then around 1967 began dividing his time between the major studios, appearing in films for Toei, Nikkatsu, and others. By the 1960s, Tazaki had developed a screen persona playing world-weary, sometimes intimidating authority figures, from Yakuza bosses to admirals in the Imperial Navy. In Toho's fantasy films, Tazaki played generals leading the fight against the monsters in King Kong vs. Godzilla, Frankenstein Conquers the World, and War of the Gargantuas, and played the main scientist in both this and Destroy All Monsters. Let's take a minute to talk about the P-1, the rocket Glenn and Fuji used to get to Planet X. Several models were built, but the biggest one was huge, more than 3 meters tall, and its size created special problems. One of these involves a scene you'll see later in which the P-1 is shown lifting off. The special effects crew wanted to show the liftoff from a low angle, but because the model was so tall, they realized that the top edge of the Planet X set in the background would be exposed almost immediately. What to do? Violating company policy, special effects art director Yasuyuki Inoue and his crew erected a barrier and, hidden from view, broke the concrete floor of the soundstage. They dug a deep hole so that the P-1 could instead rise up from the Exion's subterranean base. When the hole Inoue had dug was discovered, he apparently got into trouble with the Toho brass, but barely 3 years later did exactly the same thing to show the SY-3's liftoff from the moon in Destroy All Monsters. Although the miniatures here aren't likely to fool anyone, the cutting between the miniature astronaut and rocket ship, the composite shots integrating the live actors with the models, and the full-size set with the actors is very good, both in terms of the cutting and how everything matches.
How is it down there? A-okay.
Invasion of Astro-Monster was director Ishiro Honda's 39th film. He was 54 years old at the time, and his career was slowly winding down. 9 of his last 10 films had been sci-fi fantasy, and over the next decade he would direct 8 more movies, of which only one, 1966's Come Marry Me, didn't feature Japanese giant monster action. Honda is best described as a loyal company man, content to work in films the studio assigned him even though his interests lay elsewhere, particularly in documentaries and intimate human drama. Actor Tatsuo Matsumura, who worked with Honda on Kurosawa's Madadayo, told me he thought Honda should have been making Ozu-type dramas. Quote, "He wanted to shoot movies about ordinary life in Japan," Matsumura said. "When Kurosawa invited me to dinner, Honda happened to be there. The 3 of us had dinner, and Honda talked about seeing an ordinary, daily life kind of movie. He spoke very thoughtfully and eloquently about it, and it made a strong impression."
Fuji, what was that? Thunder and lightning. Are you all right? All in order. Okay.
As far as Shinichi Sekizawa's screenplay is concerned, I think this is probably his best scene. Finding very human-looking footprints in the sand is a surprise to first-time viewers, and Fuji's surprise upon returning to the landing site is unexpected. Uh-oh. Nick Adams was not inexperienced battling giant monsters and evil aliens. He fought a brutal pair of creatures called Calco on a fondly remembered March 1964 episode of The Outer Limits entitled Fun and Games, and the following season ran in terror from stock footage, dinosaurs, in an October episode of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea called Turn Back the Clock. Born Nicholas Aloysius Adamshock on July 10, 1931, Adams has been described by critic Leonard Maltin as the poor man's James Dean, a description neither inapt nor entirely accurate. Adams had appeared with Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, and the following year, after Dean's death, did the voice of Dean's character, Jet Rink, for the film Giant when a banquet speech had to be re-recorded. Despite Adams' image as retro tough guy who could only weakly emulate Dean and idols like Jimmy Cagney, in fact he could be perfectly fine when given good direction. He was, for instance, quite good as the nerdish, enthusiastic copyboy protege of Clark Gable in Teacher's Pet. Anyway, soon after, Adams starred as drifter Johnny Yuma, a former Confederate soldier wandering the West in The Rebel, which ran on ABC Sunday nights from 1959 to 1961, and whose guest stars included Patricia Medina and Richard Jekyll, both of whom would follow Adams to Japan. But to quote Johnny Cash's theme song, Adams, like Yuma, was a restless lad, and he spent the next several years guest starring on shows like 77 Sunset Strip and Rawhide, while trying to reestablish himself in the movies. His big break seemed to come when he co-starred with Richard Chamberlain in the now-forgotten courtroom drama Twilight of Honor, with Adams playing an Air Force veteran accused of murder. The actor threw all caution to the wind, and using $10,000 of his own money, vigorously campaigned for an Academy Award, buying ads in the trade papers and urging fellow Academy members to vote for him. He was so sure that he was going to win that he and his wife arrived early at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium where the Oscars were held that year, so that Adams could practice his walk up to the podium. When Melvin Douglas, who wasn't even there, was announced as the winner, the TV cameras reportedly lingered on Adams, whose look of shock and disappointment is the stuff of legend. Around this time, Adams criticized those abandoning Hollywood in favor of shooting abroad to reduce production costs. Runaway production, he declared, is killing us. I will never make a picture abroad. Soon after, Adams seems to have mellowed somewhat, and of course, he did make a picture abroad. Several, in fact. Under contract to MGM, I once stumbled upon a handwritten letter Adams wrote to AIP's Sam Arkoff during production of Die Monster Die, filmed in England just prior to his movies with Toho, and it's a fascinatingly gushing document flush with enthusiasm, excitement, and predictions that the film was going to be a blockbuster, suggesting that Adams either was really desperate for work, or perhaps that he was simply a genuinely friendly and polite, if somewhat naive, actor. I suspect the latter is probably true. 6 months after Invasion of Astro-Monster's release, Nick Adams returned to Japan to shoot Kokusai Himitsu Keisatsu, Zettai Zetsume, International Secret Police, Absolutely Dying, which was later given the international title The Killing Bottle. This was the fifth and final film in Toho's International Secret Police series, and was apparently co-produced by Adams' production company. Despite this, Adams was given a rather embarrassing fourth billing behind series stars Tatsuya Mihashi and Makoto Sato, as well as actress Kumi Mizuno. Though 2 different English-dubbed versions were produced, the film was never released to any English-speaking market at all, and remains elusive to this day. Less than 2 years later, after several unhappy years of failed projects and a bitter custody battle over his 2 children, Nick Adams was found dead in his Coldwater Canyon home by his attorney, Irvin Roeder. An autopsy found paraldehyde, a prescription drug used for treating alcoholism, in his system, and that the paraldehyde had fatally been mixed with a tranquilizer called promazine. The reasons for his death have and probably never will be known with any certainty. Some assume the death to have been accidental, while officially it was ruled a suicide. Still others believe Adams was murdered. In any case, his body was eventually returned to his native Pennsylvania. His headstone at the Ukrainian church cemetery there features a silhouette of Adams as the rebel, and it is inscribed, Actor of Hollywood Screens. Well, 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 surprise, surprise, Monster Zero is really King Ghidorah. Actually, even in Japan, audiences knew what was coming, as King Ghidorah was prominently featured on the original Japanese posters, in the theatrical trailer, and in both mentioned by name. The American producer of Invasion of Astro-Monster, Henry G. Saperstein, was born in 1919, and after a decade of producing sports shows and the like in the early days of television, acquired United Productions of America, UPA, in 1959. UPA was founded by former Disney animators and had produced some of the most innovative cartoon shorts of the late 1940s and early 50s, including Gerald McBoing Boing, The Telltale Heart, and Mr. Magoo. Saperstein brought Mr. Magoo to the small screen, along with Dick Tracy, and made a stab at feature animation with 1962's Gay Paris. His ultimate aim with UPA was to acquire and produce inexpensive programs for national syndication, and to some degree he patterned his company after AIP, whose strategy of targeting the drive-in market and local television stations with pre-packaged, highly exploitable movies had been very successful. Unfortunately, Saperstein wasn't so lucky. He seemed to lack both the financial resources and carefully nurtured exhibition network that AIP enjoyed. Both UPA and AIP began acquiring Japanese fantasy films around 1964. But where AIP simply acquired rights to movies like Atragon, Attack of the Mushroom People, and The Lost World of Sinbad, Saperstein took a more personal, hands-on approach, taking Japanese lessons at UCLA and learning Japanese business etiquette. He eventually acquired the rights to Mothra vs. Godzilla, but was unable to release the film on his own, and eventually sold his rights to AIP. Undeterred, in May 1965, Saperstein announced an ambitious multi-picture pact with Toho in which the Japanese studio would team up with UPA to co-produce 5 movies, including 3 with giant monsters, a war film, a spy thriller, and a television series. UPA reportedly put up half of Invasion of Astro-Monster's budget, which Saperstein said was between $800,000 and $900,000, this at a time when the Japanese yen was worth less than a third of what it is today. When I made my first film there, Saperstein told me, my suite at the Imperial Hotel was $32. That same suite today is $600, unquote. Though he disliked the structure and conventions of Japanese genre scripts, he had nothing but admiration for the Japanese crews, and especially Eiji Tsuburaya, whom he regarded as, quote, the master of special effects, and fondly recalled feeling like Paul Bunyan standing amidst Tsuburaya's miniature cityscapes. It's a morality play, Saperstein said of Godzilla in 1994. You have to imagine a giant cigar in my mouth. It's the classic story of good versus evil, white hat versus black hat. Godzilla is knocked all around until the 10th round, then comes out swinging. In later years, Saperstein's activities were focused more on licensing the UPA and Godzilla characters than he was active in film production, but shortly before his death in 1998, 2 dream projects he regarded as crowning glories were finally made: a live-action Mr. Magoo starring Leslie Nielsen, and the big-budget Hollywood adaptation of Godzilla.
Please explain our desperate need to your people on Earth and help us obtain their cooperation.
Yes, sir. We'll do our very best. Right, Glenn?
Condition green. You're cleared for immediate takeoff. We wish you a safe journey.
Thank you. We're glad we found friends on Planet X. Goodbye till we meet again.
Incidentally, that spaceship off to the right is a miniature left over from 1962's Gorath. Now we go to the diet, where the actor Takamaru Sasaki is addressing Japan's leaders. This is somewhat ironic, as Sasaki is credited with writing the Japanese lyrics to The Internationale. A freelance character actor in films from 1935, Sasaki's specialty was playing high-ranking military officers and politicians, including a stint as the Japanese Prime Minister in Gorath. His other credits include Musashi Miyamoto, Sword of Doom, and Samurai Rebellion. He died in 1986. Sasaki's family can claim 3 generations of Godzilla actors. Son-in-law Minoru Chiaki appeared in Godzilla Raids Again, while grandson Katsuhiko Sasaki starred in Godzilla vs. Megalon and Terror of Mechagodzilla. Another actor worth pointing out here, the one with the glasses, is Fuyuki Murakami. Born in 1911, Murakami almost invariably played government officials, reporters, and especially egghead scientists in Japanese fantasy films going back to the original 1954 Godzilla, in which he played Dr. Tabata. An intellectual himself, Murakami graduated from the Harvard of Japan, Tokyo University, spoke several languages including French, and like Sasaki was a member of the Shinsu Kiji Gekijo, a left-wing theater group. As scientists, Murakami appeared in such films as Rodan, The Mysterians, and Varan the Unbelievable, but he's best remembered as the inventor who turns Yoshio Tsuchiya into gas human being number 1 in The Human Vapor. His other credits include Kurosawa's Ikiru, in which he played a reporter, and Masayuki Suo's delightful 1992 comedy Sumo Do, Sumo Don't. Murakami continued to act well into his 90s. The World Education representative about to talk with Tetsuo is actor Toru Ibuki. Ibuki had been a minor but busy actor in films going back to 1962's Operation Enemy Fort. His unusual features often led to his casting as henchmen and foreign spies, hence his role here. He later turns up as Yata, the long-lost brother in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, and also appeared with Frank Sinatra in None But the Brave, and was one of the thugs Toshiro Mifune beats up in Redbeard.
Who's in charge here?
The Yakuza-like president of World Education Corp. Is actor Kenzo Tabu, yet another familiar bit player specializing in comedies, period films, and the occasional Japanese monster movie. You might remember him as the mayor in Mothra vs. Godzilla, and years later as a detective in Tampopo, and as a real estate agent in A Taxing Woman's Return. He died in 1993 at the age of 79. Oh dear, and as Tetsuo's plans for his Lady Guard alarm go up in smoke, we're coming up on a nice little moment between Glenn and Fuge, which has an authentically palsy air. A brief exchange with Fuji warning Glenn not to date, quote, the wrong type of Japanese girl. One of the best things about Adams' earlier Toho film, Frankenstein Conquers the World, was that cross-cultural romance between his character and that played by Kumi Mizuno. Her character here isn't Japanese, of course, she's an alien, and I wonder if it's for that reason that the script pretty clearly implies premarital relations and has on-screen kissing, which was pretty rare for a Japanese movie. This is also the scene where, on the original Japanese theatrical trailer, you can get a good sense of how the film was shot, with Takarada saying his lines in Japanese while Nick Adams says his in English.
Hello. Are we late?
Yes, you are.
Good afternoon, Glenn.
Hi.
Shall we?
In this scene, we see an example of the kind of family pecking order that still exists in Japan today. Haruno needs the approval of her older brother, Kazuo, before she can get married. Though this tradition isn't as rigidly followed as it once was, many engaged couples still seek the approval of older siblings at formal meetings like this one.
That's what I thought. Terry, I think a great deal of my sister, and I don't know whether you can make her happy.
I know.
You don't have to agree with him like that.
The meeting doesn't get off to a good start, as the young couple is already late, and notice the very Japanese manner in which everyone went to the table to sit down. Fuji, the older brother whose approval is needed, led the way and decided who sat where, followed by his younger sister, with poor Tetsuo trailing behind.
Excuse me.
Oh? Do you have to go?
Yep, I've got a date. The enemy is very powerful. You better do something spectacular.
It's interesting also that Glenn is more or less acting as a kind of go-between in this relationship, a buffer between Tetsuo and Fuji. When he suddenly leaves, much to Haruno's consternation, this important meeting pretty much goes up in smoke. One has to admire Haruno's keen eyesight in the bit coming up. Notice the angle in which she's somehow able to recognize Miss Namikawa.
So they were lying to me, huh?
And here the scene comes to an end with a distracted Tetsuo making a major faux pas. He allows Fuji to pay the bill.
Wait a second. What do we do?
I'll do something. First, I've got to talk to Miss Namikawa.
In the scene coming up, the Japanese self-defense forces find traces of radiation, leading them to conclude that Godzilla is indeed at the bottom of Lake Myojin. This is just about the only reference to the kind of menace the character symbolized in the original 1954 Gojira. Incidentally, although there is a small lake in Japan called Myojin, the lake as seen in the movie is largely fictional.
The search party has confirmed he's at the bottom of the lake.
Also coming up, we have several strange loose ends leading nowhere. Why does Glenn whisper into Fuji's ear? Why do they drive miles into the middle of nowhere? Is Glenn worried about being overheard? Did Exian fifth columnist infiltrate World Space Authority in an earlier draft of Shinichi Sekizawa's screenplay? As enjoyable as the film is, it's not exactly logical or dramatically sound. The story begs one rather obvious question. If the Exians were already on Earth to begin with and could always control the monsters, why pretend to be peaceful aliens in need of Earth's help? Why offer the miracle drug at all?
Yeah, this is the same way I went with the girl.
Here, we have a strange reference to a scene that might have appeared in early drafts of the script, though apparently was never filmed, about a late-night visit by the controller of Planet X in the bungalow hideaway that Glenn is sharing with Miss Namikawa. During this time, the Japanese had a tendency to get their films out right away, sometimes within days after shooting is wrapped. You can see some evidence of this here. Note the leaves on the trees, indicating that this was probably late October or early November, not long before the film went into release.
Don't ask me. But say, didn't the girl see him?
What do you think? She said she got scared because I was groaning in my sleep. Hey, you know something, Fuji? I think maybe we're putting too much trust in Planet X.
That's right. I don't think there's any doubt about it.
Maybe they don't have any water up there. Maybe they figure it's time to move.
Okay, let's go to that bungalow and look around.
Okay, right ahead. Hold!
Base authority.
Okay, sir.
The actor playing the general here is Yoshibumi Tajima, another prolific character actor. Born in 1918, Tajima was a member of Hayuza, one of Japan's great theater companies, and made his screen debut in Kon Ichikawa's 1953 film Pooh-san, as in Mr. Pooh. He first met director Ishiro Honda outside the confines of Toho when Tajima played a small part in Honda's Junior High Night School, an independent production released through Daiei. The two must have hit it off because Tajima immediately signed with Toho and over the next 14 years would appear in nearly all of Honda's films. In genre films, he played a wide range of roles, but most frequently military types, detectives, and henchmen. You might remember him as military officers in Frankenstein Conquers the World, This, and Destroy All Monsters, as detectives in The H-Man, War of the Gargantuas, and All Monsters Attack, or perhaps for his henchman parts in Ghidorah the Space Monster and King Kong Escapes. And now the Exion's UFO appears. According to film historian and genre expert Oki Miyano, these smoke effects were created by filling a thermos bottle with liquid nitrogen, then exploding the thermos underwater, thus creating a chemical reaction with the H2O. It's very effective. The tractor beam used to transport Godzilla and Rodan was designed by optical animator Sadao Iizuka, which he said was patterned after the neon sign advertising a nightclub he saw in Tokyo's Shibuya ward. As we look at this terrific series of matte shots and full-size mock-up of the UFO's lower half, it's easy to appreciate the widescreen compositions that for years had been thwarted by bad telecine work in the panned and scanned 16mm prints that always played on local television. A word about Toho Scope, then, the anamorphic widescreen process used on nearly every Toho movie from the late 1950s until the trade name was essentially abandoned in favor of generic CinemaScope in 1968. Toho Scope, 2 words, was introduced in the 1957 film Oatari Sanshoku Musume, or 3 Types of Girls Make a Big Hit, which Toho retitled On Wings of Love for the international market. So crude was the process back then that Toho's cameramen reportedly used packing tape to attach the initial anamorphic lenses to their cameras. This very enjoyable musical, which featured Akira Takarada as star Hibari Misora's boyfriend, was also released in Perspecta stereophonic sound, with all kinds of directional dialogue and sound effects. It was not, however, Toho's first widescreen movie. 6 weeks before, Toho had released Kaiju o Godzilla, or Monster King Godzilla, in which the American version of Gojira, the one with the added scenes featuring Raymond Burr, had been converted to anamorphic widescreen. Although both Godzilla and Burr had a tendency to be cut off at the eyebrows, the effect is rather interesting.
However, we delayed our arrival awaiting authority.
Hidden behind those very hip sunglasses as the controller of Planet X is Yoshio Tsuchiya, a gregarious, famously eccentric actor and for many years a favorite of Japanese film fans. According to genre scholar Guy Tucker, Tsuchiya, quote, looked to various European dialects and also imagined the tongue of the water demon Kappa for inspiration, unquote, in creating the strange speech patterns of the controller, which unfortunately are lost in the dubbed version. Tsuchiya was born in 1927 and had played a tiny part in Tadashi Imai's The Tower of Lilies before making his official debut the following year in Kurosawa's Seven Samurai as the tormented Rikichi, the peasant farmer whose wife has been kidnapped by marauding bandits. Over the next 10 years, Tsuchiya appeared in most of Kurosawa's films, and right before Invasion of Astro-Monster went into production, had spent many months playing Dr. Mori, the dedicated, overworked physician in love with Reiko Dan's Osugi in Kurosawa's Redbeard. After making such a strong impression in Seven Samurai, Toho offered Tsuchiya a string of conventional parts that the actor found pretty dull, including the genre films Tomei Ningen, marketed abroad as The Invisible Avenger, Godzilla Raids Again, and The H-Man. But Tsuchiya found his niche when in 1957 Ishiro Honda cast him as the weird alien leader of the Mysterians. And over the years, Tsuchiya came to relish the parts Honda offered him, from men possessed by outer space invaders in Battle in Outer Space and Destroy All Monsters, to characters on the verge of madness in Son of Godzilla, Matango, and one of Tsuchiya's biggest roles as the Human Vapor. However, probably his most challenging part, and certainly his most unusual film, was Toshio Matsumoto's wildly experimental Funeral Parade of Roses, in which Tsuchiya played a gay nightclub owner and the object of transvestite Peter's affections. After appearing in 1970's Space Amoeba, first released in the United States as Yog, Monster from Space, Tsuchiya worked mainly on the stage, but memorably returned to the genre as war veteran Shindo in 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. The actor here is named Nadao Kirino, another prolific character actor, bit player, who appeared in more than a dozen films for Ishiro Honda, as well as myriad fantasy TV shows like Tsuburaya's Ultra Q.
Why, of course.
In Honda's films, he usually had small parts, and in Japan is probably better remembered for his comedies, where he often played naive salaryman types.
We have to get that data on the miracle drug.
Glenn's going too?
Sure. And Dr. Sakura.
This girl, the girl that Glenn's been going around with. Is she okay? A nice girl?
Why don't you ask Glenn?
As we come to the love scenes between Glenn and Namikawa, let's talk a bit about the relationship between Nick Adams and Kumi Mizuno. In January 1965, Adams appeared on The Les Crane Show and announced that he was divorcing his wife of 5.5 years, actress Carol Nugent. This came as a surprise to Nugent, as he hadn't bothered to tell her yet. "That's Nick for you," she later said. "He called me up this afternoon and told me to watch the show." They soon reconciled, however, and in February 1965, Carol accompanied Adams to England for Die Monster Die. But once in Japan, Adams became attracted to Kumi Mizuno during the production of Frankenstein Conquers the World that spring. This despite the fact that Carol had come to Japan as well, with their 2 children in tow. As Allison Lee Adams told writer Steve Reifel, "That's one of the reasons my parents were divorced. My dad had a penchant for becoming infatuated with his leading ladies." They separated in July, and Nugent filed for divorce that September. Soon after, on October 10th, Adams left for Japan to make Invasion of Astro-Monster, accompanied by producer Tomoyuki Tanaka, with Adams' scenes shot over 5 weeks, from October 13th through November 18th, 1965. When I interviewed Kumi Mizuno in 1996, she stated that Adams had indeed proposed to her, but she says that she refused him on the grounds that she was already engaged to another man. Nevertheless, she spoke very fondly of her 3-time American co-star, recalling dinners at her house and nighttime phone calls from him where she'd hold a dictionary in one hand trying to communicate. In fact, he was by all accounts a much-liked man on the Toho lot. Henry Saperstein considered Adams a consummate professional, while all his co-stars found him quite charming. Takarada, for example, remembers becoming friends with Adams during pre-production, and that the two went out drinking a lot. Unlike many of the American stars that would follow in his footsteps, Adams, according to Mizuno, immersed himself in Japanese culture and the Japanese film industry. He tried to understand Japan and its people. Invasion of Astro-Monster was Akira Takarada's 99th movie in a career that ultimately would span more than half a century. He was born on April 29, 1934, in Harbin, in northeastern China, not far from the Russian and Inner Mongolian borders. At the age of 19, he joined Toho Studios as part of its 6th New Face class, an annual recruiting program in which actors underwent a 6-month regime of acting, dancing, and singing lessons long before ever appearing in front of the camera. It was this program, along with similar New Face classes at the other studios, that resulted in some of the biggest stars of the post-war period, including Toshiro Mifune. Takarada made his screen debut at the age of 20 in a long-forgotten film called How the Bell of Liberty Rings. But it was his second movie, the original Ghidorah, in which Takarada shot to fame. He quickly established himself as a debonair yet sensitive romantic leading man, finding his niche in a studio dominated by comedians like Hisaya Murashige and tough guy actors like Mifune. Literally tall, dark, and handsome, Takarada came to epitomize worldly sophistication. After being paired with Momoko Kochi in several films, and after supporting big-name female stars like Hibari Misora and Chiemi Eri in 1950s romantic dramas and musicals like Fighting Cha-Cha Girl and Jax and Jills, Takarada began starring in films of his own. Early on, he headlined a wide range of movies, from thrillers like Kihachi Okamoto's The Big Boss, in which Takarada also sang, to Samurai Saga, a Japanese take on Cyrano de Bergerac, with Mifune, the ugly, flat-nosed Cyrano, to Takarada's handsome, if inarticulate, Christian de Nouvelle. He also appeared in musicals like Me and Me, starring pop star twin sensations The Peanuts, and The Poem of the Blue Star, in which struggling jazz pianist Takarada and trumpet player Tadao Takashima starred in this throwback to the Fox musicals of the 1940s, complete with an elaborate history of jazz finale. By the early 1960s, Takarada's stock began to rise even further. Mainly this was due to his long and fruitful association with acclaimed director Mikio Naruse. Takarada first appeared in Naruse's 1959 film A Whistle in My Heart, and then went on to co-star or support almost every film Naruse made until his death, including Evening Stream, also known as The Lovelorn Geisha, Daughters, Wives, and a Mother, 1962's Lonely Lane, a film biography of author Fumiko Hayashi, and A Woman's Life. Takarada also landed a key role in Ozu's The End of Summer, the director's only film for Toho, in which Takarada played the boyfriend of the Kobayakawa family's youngest daughter, played by Yoko Tsukasa. Meanwhile, his star status peaked, and his reputation as a sophisticated internationalist was secured in a string of co-productions with Hong Kong's Cathay organization, in films that also made use of the actor's fluent Mandarin. The first, released in 1961, was Yasuki Chiba's A Night in Hong Kong, a romantic melodrama similar to Love is a Many-Splendored Thing, about a Japanese news correspondent, played by Takarada, who falls in love with a Japanese-Chinese nurse, played by Hong Kong star Yu Ming. The film was a big hit, and so the following year came Star of Hong Kong, with Takarada this time falling in love with a Chinese medical student, again played by Yu Ming. Star of Hong Kong expanded its exotic locales to include Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, while the following years Honolulu, Tokyo, Hong Kong added Hawaii to the mix. By now, Takarada was much too big a star to appear in ordinary sci-fi fantasy films, but 1961's The Last War, a big-budget and prestigious production somewhat patterned after On the Beach, was an exception. That film starred actors who, up to that point, weren't associated with such films, including Nobuko Otoa and Chishu Ryu. Mothra vs. Godzilla was also something of an exception, as it came on the heels of the hugely popular King Kong vs. Godzilla and promised massive mainstream appeal. The year Invasion of Astro-Monster was produced, Takarada appeared in just 5 films. Start Here, starring Yuriko Hoshi and Reiko Dan, The Longest Night, another co-production with Hong Kong, White Rose of Hong Kong, a Japanese-Taiwanese crime film directed by Jun Fukuda, and 100 Shot, 100 Killed, a terrific globe-trotting James Bond spoof also directed by Fukuda, co-starring Mie Hama. As is often the case with Japanese monster movies, the actual monster battle is pretty short compared with the build-up that preceded it, and the battle for Planet X lasts barely 2 minutes. So maybe this is a good time to talk about the evolution of Godzilla and Rodan's characters. The transformation of Godzilla from the personification of the nuclear threat to savior of the Earth was a gradual one. And what's nice about these Godzilla films from the middle and late 1960s is that while Godzilla has definitely been humanized somewhat, he's still a giant monster capable of mass destruction, and for the most part, the human characters just want to get the hell out of his way. He had been an essentially evil character in both King Kong vs. Godzilla and Mothra vs. Godzilla, but in Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, audiences were for the first time on Godzilla's side, rooting for Godzilla, Mothra, and Rodan to defeat the evil King Ghidorah. Indeed, I recall seeing a 35mm print of Ghidorah in the late 1980s in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and while the audience of mostly college students had come to laugh at the picture, they gasped when Mothra was hit by one of Ghidorah's electrical bolts and thrown into the air. And from that point on, they cheered the heroic trio and applauded their victory. Godzilla and Rodan's function in Invasion of Astro-Monster is much the same, with Rodan unfortunately reduced to something like a sidekick, and without the voracious characteristics of both birds and reptiles on display in the original Rodan. In both Ghidorah and Invasion of Astro-Monster, Rodan's function is almost like Andy Clyde in a Hopalong Cassidy western. After exploring the craters of Planet X, Akira Takarada witnessed the burning of Atlanta, originating the part of Rhett Butler in a massive 1966 stage production of Gone with the Wind. So extravagant was the production that Eiji Tsuburaya was hired to supervise its special effects. Now we come to one of the film's most iconic images, the little victory jig Godzilla does that's known in Japan as the Gojira Shei. The Gojira Shei apparently originated with Oso Matsukun, the creation of manga pioneer Fujio Akatsuka, in which one of its characters would shout Kairyu Dansu Shei, Dragon Dance Shei. This happy moment, as the controller of Planet X describes it, was a very controversial addition to the film. Actor Yoshio Tsuchiya claims to have suggested it to special effects director Tsuburaya, who was keen on the idea of humanizing the monsters with such moments, even though virtually everyone else, including Godzilla actor Haruo Nakajima, effects cinematographer Sadamasa Arikawa, and director Honda were all opposed to the idea. As Akira Takarada's stage work increased, his star status in movies gradually declined, and his enjoyable star turn in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster can be viewed as something of a step down as far as his star status was concerned. He appeared in 2 more genre films featuring American actors, King Kong Escapes and Latitude Zero, partly because Takarada also spoke a smattering of English, but also because at 5 feet 11 inches, the unusually tall actor would match up well with his American co-stars. Though King Kong Escapes was shot using the same method as Invasion of Astro-Monster, with the Americans saying their lines in English while the Japanese cast spoke Japanese, 1969's Latitude Zero was shot entirely in English, and both Takarada and co-star Masumi Okada come off fairly well. A testament to Takarada's enduring charm came in 1996 when I interviewed him at Tokyo's Imperial Hotel. During the interview, he was spotted by a group of middle-aged women at a nearby table, all of whom made like Lucy Ricardo at the Brown Derby. Nevertheless, after the interview was over, and without any prompting by them, Takarada very graciously strolled over to their table to say hello, politely inquiring about what, for the women, was obviously an exotic afternoon out. Needless to say, he made their day, and I was greatly impressed with his Cary Grant-like classiness.
Glenn, let's get out of here.
You can really see the natural chemistry of Takarada and Adams here. You almost expect them to do the patty cake routine from all those Hope and Crosby Road movies. Reprising their roles from Ghidorah in the parts of Godzilla, Rodan, and King Ghidorah are respectively Haruo Nakajima, Masashi Shinohara, and Shoichi Hirose, whose nickname incidentally was Solomon. He really must have been a Solomon to endure the rigors of playing King Ghidorah, a thankless role with limited opportunity for expression. The poor actor was forced to stand for long stretches, yet could do little more than hold on to the small metal crossbar hidden inside the costume. It had no arms, and stomped Ghidorah's feet while the wireworks operators manipulated its 3 heads and wings. All this must have been particularly hard on Hirose, who was already 47 years old while Invasion of Astro-Monster was in production. By contrast, Nakajima was a still fairly muscular 37. Though he would return to playing the kind of henchman and thug parts he usually essayed, this was to be Hirose's last giant monster role. All 3 were busy background extras and sometimes doubles and stuntmen, who can be spotted in dozens of films if you know where to look. Nakajima had been playing Godzilla since the first film in 1954 and would continue doing so until he retired from monster suit acting in 1972. It's to his credit that, like Peter Cushing's Victor Frankenstein, Nakajima infuses the character with a personality that, regardless of whether the script calls for Godzilla to be a hero or a villain, is consistently, recognizably his. And now about the costumes. All 3 monsters got makeovers of varying degrees. The Godzilla costume is brand new, as the one built for Mothra vs. Godzilla and used again on Ghidorah and in public appearances was by 1965 falling apart. The new costume was built by Teizo Toshimitsu, and in consideration of Godzilla's evolving image, is given more humanized, less threatening features. Gone are Godzilla's clearly defined kneecaps from the previous 2 films with legs that are, in the words of series expert Ed Gajucheski, more pants-like. The breastbone from the 1964 costume is retained but de-emphasized, and the dorsal fins are less pointy. Probably the most striking change is the look of Godzilla's face. If the 1954 Godzilla looked dragon-like and the 1962 suit reptilian, the head of the Daisenso Goji, as this suit was called, could be described as frog-like, with Godzilla having notably larger and more playful eyes, a strong contrast to the sinister, hooded eye look of the 1964 costume. Later in the film, you'll be able to see Godzilla's pupils move from left to right, with a ventriloquist dummy-like mechanism also added to the costume. What looks like acne on Godzilla's neck are actually the eye holes for Haruo Nakajima to see through. This costume would be used again in Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster and would reappear briefly in Destroy All Monsters for that film's water shots of Godzilla's attack on New York City. The King Ghidorah and Rodan costumes are the same ones used in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, though both have been modified somewhat. Again, we have some very nice intercutting between the actors and the monster suit guys, with several different miniatures as the clone P-1 lifts off from Planet X, essentially abandoning Godzilla and Rodan in the process. The King Ghidorah costume has been repainted a darker shade of gold, which I think somehow works to make the creature seem more alive and less like a traditional Chinese dragon. Ed Godjucheski notes how the settling of the rubber in the facial features make the heads less detailed, but I rather like these imperfections, which again somehow make the creature seem more believable. The Rodan costume is apparently the same one from Ghidorah, at least no photographs of a new costume being constructed have ever surfaced. In any case, Rodan's wings have been extensively reworked, with the bulky, angular tops flattened out and thinned noticeably.
Is anything wrong?
The day my brother and Glenn
Let's take a moment and put Invasion of Astro-Monster into context. When it was released at the end of 1965, the top-grossing foreign films in Japan that year were, starting backwards from number 10, Weekend at Dunkirk, the French-Italian co-production starring Jean-Paul Belmondo, George Stevens' Cinerama Roadshow, The Greatest Story Ever Told, Von Ryan's Express starring Frank Sinatra, Henry Hathaway's Circus World, another big roadshow starring John Wayne, John Frankenheimer's The Train, John Ford's Cheyenne Autumn, a reissue of Walt Disney's 1955 film Lady and the Tramp, The Sound of Music, My Fair Lady, and the number one film in Japan that year, the James Bond movie Goldfinger, which earned about $2 million in 1965 dollars. As a sign that the economics of the Japanese movie industry were changing, the four top-grossing foreign films did substantially better than the top-grossing Japanese ones, though they still did pretty well. Invasion of Astro-Monster was the 9th highest-grossing domestic film, earning 287,550,000 yen in rentals, which in 1965 was about $800,000. Considering it made more money than the $20 million Greatest Story Ever Told, that's still quite an achievement. Akira Kurosawa's Redbeard was 1965's biggest domestic hit, but the year was dominated by gritty Ken Takakura movies made at Toei and wild comedies produced at Toho. The other top Japanese movies were, in descending order, Teruo Ishii's Abashiri Prison Northeast Seacoast Story, starring Ken Takakura, Shigehiro Ozawa's Invitation to a Duel in Kanto, starring Koji Tsuruta, another Abashiri Prison movie, Saga of Homesickness, Masahiro Makino's Japanese Yakuza Book of Kanto with Takakura, Return from Abashiri Prison, Kengo Furusawa's Daiboken, a Crazy Cats comedy, and The Boss of Pickpocket Bay, another Crazy Cats movie.
Yes. It is according to the directions on the carton.
At the far right of the frame is a man named Hans Horneff, one of dozens of amateur thespians living in Japan who supplemented their day job income appearing as extras but also sometimes fairly major supporting roles in all kinds of Japanese movies. Horneff's career goes back at least to 1961 when he appeared in two big Toho movies, Daredevil in the Castle with Toshiro Mifune, and later that year, The Last War. He's also in Crazy Cats Go to Hong Kong, Terror Beneath the Sea, and Battle of the Japan Sea, the last film featuring effects personally directed by Eiji Tsuburaya. I can't tell you exactly when it came into vogue, but around this time and continuing well into the mid-1970s and even into the early 80s, Japanese filmmakers loved sticking in these kind of montages consisting of black and white photographs, often showing political unrest, student protests, and the like. Director Kinji Fukasaku especially liked this visual bridge and uses it in many of his films, including several of his Battles Without Honor and Humanity movies. After Mizuno, perhaps no one was closer to Nick Adams during this time than actor Yoshio Tsuchiya. The two became good friends during production, mercilessly teasing one another about their performances and occasionally pulling practical jokes. Tsuchiya was especially ruthless in this regard, teaching Adams inappropriate Japanese expressions like hara hetta, which means I'm starving, and mo karimaka, which is a Kansai dialect for are you making a profit, and which would be like teaching Toshiro Mifune to talk like a hillbilly. It was hilarious, Tsuchiya said. Everyone was saying, who's teaching Nick to say all these weird things? Significantly, Tsuchiya seemed to be the only one of Adams' Japanese co-workers to recognize the American's troubled state of mind, saying years later that he found Adams cheerful but also, quote, terribly introverted. Tsuchiya also recognized Adams' genuineness. Adams pressed Tsuchiya for an autographed photo of the actor that he could take back home to America and put on his living room wall. Tsuchiya was flattered but assumed he was simply being polite. However, soon thereafter, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka visited Adams' Coldwater Canyon home and was surprised to find Yoshio Tsuchiya's picture prominently on display. Adams' performance may seem embarrassingly hammy to Western eyes, but actually it conforms to the style of high-key film acting common to Japanese genre films even today. This was often the source of friction when American actors appeared in Japanese productions. The American actors would be asked to play their scenes big, and instead would resist such direction to the point of going to the opposite extreme, such as Russ Tamblin's somnambulistic stroll through War of the Gargantuas. You can accuse Adams of chewing the scenery, but it's not inappropriate for his role or the film. To see a perfect balance between American and Japanese styles of film acting, you might want to check out Herb Edelman's wonderful performance in Tora-san's Dream of Spring. Incidentally, Nick Adams was not the first Hollywood star to appear in a Japanese movie. For instance, Martha Heyer starred in a 1952 Japanese-American co-production called Geisha Girl, while that same year former MGM child star Margaret O'Brien appeared opposite Japan's biggest female star, teenager Hibari Misora, in Girls Hand in Hand, an entirely Japanese-made production. The same year Invasion of Astro-Monster was released, Toho co-financed Frank Sinatra's None But the Brave, which features special effects by Eiji Tsuburaya.
Fuji,
Yes, sir?
King Ghidorah's in the United States.
I know.
What's that?
Some more trouble. Has the council decided?
Not yet. The military men want to use all our nuclear weapons and then resist them to the bitter end.
We'll be wiped out by the radioactivity.
We've a tiger.
We're coming up on a line of dialogue that always gets a big reaction whenever Invasion of Astro-Monster is shown. Let's just sit back and enjoy it, shall we? Let's take a few moments now to talk about Toho Studios and what they were up to in 1965. Located in Seijo, a now wealthy western enclave of Setagaya Ward in Tokyo, Toho Studios was one of 5 major film companies that existed in the mid-1960s, the others being Toei, Nikatsu, Shochiku, and Daiei. Surprisingly, this model of the melting radar dish was built not by a member of Eiji Tsuburaya's staff, but rather by chief carpenter Keiki Tanaka, whose credits include films directed by Kurosawa, Naruse, and Inagaki. In the mid-1960s, Toho was scaling back on the number of its releases, 44 feature films in 1965 compared with the 79 that it had released just 5 years before. 2/3 of its features that year were in color, and all but one of them was in scope. The year included such memorable films as Kihachi Okamoto's Samurai Assassin, Masaki Kobayashi's Kwaidan, Kon Ichikawa's Tokyo Olympiad, Kurosawa's Redbeard, Susumu Hani's Bwana Toshi, starring Kiyoshi Atsumi and filmed on location in Africa, Shiro Toyoda's Yotsuya Kaidan, yet another adaptation of that famous ghost story, and a big war movie, Retreat from Kiska, starring Toshiro Mifune and featuring Eiji Tsuburaya's special effects. These prestige productions were largely funded by the enduring popularity of Toho's comedies, including new films in the Shacho and Ekimae series starring Hisaya Morishige, and the free-for-all abandon of Hitoshi Ueki, Hajime Hana, and the Crazy Cats. Of Toho's 44 films, 33, or 75%, could be considered comedies, with 9 dramas, 6 thrillers, 3 war movies, 2 ghost story films, 2 romantic musicals, 2 giant monster movies, and a documentary rounding out the package. Besides Mifune, Morishige, and Ueki, the studio's other top male stars of the year were Yuzo Kayama, Tatsuya Mihashi, Yosuke Natsuki, and Makoto Sato. The top female stars that year were Yoko Tsukasa, Michio Aratama, Shikage Awashima, Reiko Dan, Yuriko Hoshi, Mie Hama, and Junko Ikeuchi. Acclaimed actors Tatsuya Nakadai and Tsutomu Yamazaki made several films for Toho in 1965, but neither was under long-term contract.
You are to seek out and kill every human being. Action begins in 20 hours.
The part of the Minister of Defense is played by veteran character actor Gen Shimizu, whom you might remember as the scandal-plagued executive who throws himself under a truck near the beginning of Kurosawa's The Bad Sleep Well. Shimizu was a regular in Kurosawa's movies, with small but juicy roles in films like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo. Born on New Year's Day, 1907, Shimizu debuted in films in 1940 and essentially played the same character in 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan, his last film, and he died later that year. Western audiences usually assume the actor dressed in the religious garb there, Somesho Matsumoto, is supposed to be a Buddhist priest, but the mixture of religious iconography also suggests something like a Catholic bishop. The Japanese credits are of no help, as Matsumoto is billed only as, quote, religious representative.
Fuji, Consul, how are you coming?
All right.
Invasion of Astro-Monster took so long to reach American shores that by the time it was released on July 20th, 1970, the next several Godzilla films from 1966 and 67, Sea Monster and Son of Godzilla, had already been shown on American television, and the one after that, Destroy All Monsters, had played drive-ins.
Yes, sir.
Under the title Monster Zero, the film turned up as part of a double bill with Saperstein's War of the Gargantuas. What took so long? In interviews, Saperstein claimed that the process of preparing an international version simply took longer than expected, but in fact the American version was ready within a few months of its Japanese release. During this time, Saperstein had a falling out with AIP's Sam Arkoff, and their business relationship was severed after the release of Woody Allen's What's Up, Tiger Lily in 1966, which Saperstein had produced. In truth, they never got along, and their relationship was strained going back to Saperstein's involvement on Mothra vs. Godzilla in 1964. Without AIP to distribute his AIP-like movies to the drive-in market, Saperstein was stuck with several movies nobody else wanted. He finally struck a deal with Marin Films, a small-time operator whose short list of eclectic releases includes The Castle of Fu Manchu, The Projectionist, King, a filmed record, and The Manipulator. A different English version, separately prepared by Toho's international division, was released in Britain as Invasion of the Astro-Monsters. Yet another version of Invasion of Astro-Monster surfaced in Japanese movie theaters on March 7, 1971. Kaiju Daisenso Kingu Ghidorah Tai Gojira, or The Great Giant Monster War King Ghidorah vs. Godzilla, was a heavily cut version of Invasion of Astro-Monster created especially for children's matinees. Director Honda reluctantly cut his film down to 74 breathlessly paced minutes, concentrating on the kind of monster action that would most appeal to kids. The film was part of a continuing series of Toho Champion Matsuri releases. In this case, an afternoon's entertainment that included Attack Number 1, Tears of a Phoenix, a 55-minute cartoon about a girls' volleyball team, Provincial Boy, an animated short from Noboru Kawasaki's manga, Moomin from Tove Jansson's Moomin books, and Insect Story, Orphan Bee Hachi, Mother of the Moon. The Champion Matsuri version of Invasion of Astro-Monster has been released to home video in Japan.
You were right.
This, of course, was inserted later for the English language version. Ha! Some love letter, huh? Look at the signature on the bottom. I guess she and Glenn were never on a first-name basis. Then again, we never learned Glenn's first name either, though according to the label on his spacesuit, we know it begins with the letter F. Although Nick Adams' voice was heard in the original Japanese Coming Attractions trailer, with his English dialogue subtitled into Japanese, the decision was made to dub his entire performance for the version released in Japan. The actor often credited with dubbing Nick Adams' voice is Toho character actor Tadashi Okabe, but this is incorrect. Actually, the voice for the Japanese version was provided by prolific voice actor Goro Naya, best remembered as Inspector Zenigata in Lupin III. Isn't it great how that guard sticks his tongue out while he's being choked? What a performance. Anyway, as we get a good look at the curled-up boots the Exians wear, and the wrought iron designs at their hideout, considered very European and popular in Japan at the time, Akira Kubo gets ready to say what is reported to be the most frequently uttered line in the movies.
Come on, let's get out of here.
If you look to the left of the frame, notice how the Exians struggle to get up those steps. Those sunglasses really must have limited their vision, while the skin-tight design of the costumes, with their low crotch, had to have limited their leg movements.
Prisoners have escaped. Please handle.
And here again we have some really good cutting and matching, and an excellent and, I think, completely convincing miniature blowing up.
That's that. Back to control.
Akira Kubo is somewhat cast against type as nerdy inventor Tetsuo, though a lot of the nerdiness is because of the dubbing rather than the actor's performance. And as writer David Callett points out in his book about the Godzilla series, Kubo's character is almost identical to that played by Kenji Sahara in King Kong vs. Godzilla. Both are inventor boyfriends of the hero's sister, a character the hero doesn't respect until the end, when the inventor comes up with something that helps save everyone. Kubo was born exactly 1 month prior to frequent co-star Kumi Mizuno in December 1936, and at the age of 10 began appearing in educational and industrial films. He made his narrative film debut at the age of 15 in 1952. Because of his youthful good looks, Kubo worked steadily in a wide range of pictures in the 1950s, often playing recklessly impulsive youths in teen dramas, university students in Toho comedies, and loyal soldiers in its war films. His best role came in a film released 3 weeks prior to the first Gojira, an acclaimed adaptation of Yukio Mishima's novel Shiosai, or The Sound of the Waves, directed by Senkichi Taniguchi, in which Kubo had the leading role of Shinji opposite Kyoko Aoyama's Hatsue. Kubo continued to enjoy leading roles throughout the 1950s, but never really caught on with the public in a major way. During the 1960s, Kubo tended to play leading roles in ensemble cast films like Matango, or supporting roles in big-scale films, particularly Toho's war movies, and occasionally prestige productions such as Kurosawa's Throne of Blood and Sanjuro. Still, American fans remember him best for his fantasy films, which include leading roles in Son of Godzilla, Destroy All Monsters, and Space Amoeba. In recent years, Kubo has done a few films, lots of television and stage work, and has appeared in commercials for Japanese sake, banks, and cruise ship lines. The film's often very impressive art direction was the work of Takeo Kita, whose Planet X sets are one of the film's outstanding features. His career goes back to the silent era, back at least to the late 1920s, when he worked at Nikatsu Studios. He joined PCL, the forerunner of Toho, at its inception, and worked on nearly 200 of its movies. At PCL Toho, he worked on films of all kinds, from Jidaigeki period films to contemporary comedies, but the focus of his work changed in 1954 when he served as supervising art director on the original Gojira. He apparently developed an especially good reputation coordinating his designs with that of the special effects crew, and during the 1960s worked almost exclusively on films mixing live action with lots of visual effects sequences. In addition to providing the art direction to every single Godzilla movie through 1969, Kita did almost all of Toho's war movies and historical and fantasy spectacles, as well as its other giant monster movies. As the climactic battle begins, note the myriad effects used to bring this sequence to life. We've got miniature vehicles, including high-tech weaponry, A-cycle light ray cannons in this case, that anticipate the futuristic maser cannons of the following year's War of the Gargantuas.
Computations are returning to normal. Good. Increase the attack. We too go into
Okay, now, here's the payoff. These are the money shots. This is what audiences came to see. And Eiji Tsuburaya and his special effects crew doesn't let us down. One thing that's nice about Invasion of Astro-Monster is that here, in new footage, Rodan gets to act like the Rodan of old. Except for the character's first appearance in the original 1956 Rodan, the creature tended to be pretty comical, his head bobbing around like a jack-in-the-box, or maybe the giant claw. But here, for this brief sequence, it's a welcome return to that menace of old. We also have a big Godzilla foot, used for those terrific close-ups of Godzilla thrashing thatched roof houses. Take note of Mount Fuji, Fujisan, in the background. There's really a clever symmetry at work here. Remember how, in the Battle of Planet X, the lower half of Jupiter seemed to hang down over the planet? Here, with Fujisan shooting up in the background, the opposite image is achieved, with the volcano rising up from the bowels of the earth.
destroy all moving vehicles.
Because Japan was still in the midst of its post-war recovery, Godzilla's size relative to the kinds of buildings that existed in both urban and rural areas back then works really well. In recent years, on the so-called Heisei Godzilla movies, Toho's special effects crews faced a daunting problem. The skyscrapers of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and elsewhere would have dwarfed the 1960s Godzilla, so they were forced to make Godzilla bigger too. Unfortunately, this meant sacrificing a lot of the detail and advantages that went along with having a smaller Godzilla.
Order Zero to join the attack.
Amidst all this destruction, you're about to see some bits and pieces of special effects footage culled from earlier movies. As the attendance for Godzilla movies began to slide downward, Toho began looking for ways to save money. One of these was to recycle footage from earlier films, and coming up you'll see destruction footage from both the 1956 Rodan and 1961's Mothra. This is footage from Rodan, which is pretty obvious because that film was shot standard size, and the footage here has been grainily converted to Toho scope. I think Ghidorah is really used well throughout this film. The gracefully flapping wings, those wonderfully jittering heads skittering about like downed power lines spewing out electricity, He's really a movie monster like no other. And with the exception of Ghidorah's brief appearance at the end of Destroy All Monsters, the character would never again be used quite this well. Ironically enough, a lot of this new footage would appear as stock scenes in 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan. Looking at these stock shots from Rodan coming up, you can really see how much urban Japan has changed. The little pockets resembling the Japan of the mid-1960s still exist today. Incidentally, some great 8mm footage exists, shot during the production of Ghidorah, which shows a large number of middle-aged women meticulously gluing tiny roof tiles to the miniature houses that the monsters were going to thrash in that film. Great stuff. And here we have some bits from Mothra, lifted from that film's destruction of Newkirk City, which you can tell by the Newkirk motor sign. Speaking of signs, here we have a camera shop suspiciously named Tsubumeya. Could that have been a deliberate in-joke? Although Toho had produced two epic alien invasion movies before this, 1957's The Mysterians and 1959's Battle in Outer Space, Astro-Monster was really the first time that Earth's giant monsters were pitted against alien ones, while the human characters fought the humanoid aliens controlling them, and the first time that creatures from outer space tried to use Earth's monsters to do their dirty work. In this sense, Astro-Monster became a kind of template for many of the Godzilla movies to follow, including Destroy All Monsters, Godzilla vs. Gigan, Terror of Mechagodzilla, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and Godzilla Final Wars. Unless you're a hardcore Godzilla fan, the use of stock scenes in Invasion of Astro-Monster is pretty imperceptible. This is quite a contrast to some of the Godzilla films of the 1970s, which lifted scenes whole cloth from the 1960s films, especially this one, in films like Godzilla vs. Gigan and Godzilla vs. Megalon. That shot of the mobile oil gas station especially turns up in these later films. Director Honda was disheartened by the use of such footage, saying, quote, "It was a vicious cycle of time and budget. If we recycled scenes from previous movies, we could cut the effects budget. But then we received complaints from our fans saying, it looks weird, it's not fresh. We could fool audiences for a little while, but eventually they would know the trick and stop coming to see the shows."
So that you can make the sound we broadcast as loud as possible.
Doctor, plan's begun broadcasting. Stand by to attack.
Stand by.
Okay, that does it. Now let's go to McQuarrie Island.
Okay.
We repeat, this is an emergency. The unpleasant noise you hear on your radio receiver is not a mistake. Do not turn off your set, but turn up
Invasion
the
of
volume
Astro-Monster
as
was
high
the
as
sixth
possible.
Godzilla movie,
This is an
and it's worth
emergency.
summarizing here how the series had evolved. The original 1954 film, Gojira, was a serious-minded, cautionary tale about the proliferation of nuclear weapons that was also a commercial venture patterned after popular American films like King Kong and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. The second Godzilla film, 1955's Godzilla Raids Again, was a quickie sequel designed to do little more than cash in on the success of the first picture. The third Godzilla movie, however, 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla, was produced on a grand scale to celebrate Toho Studios' 30th anniversary, in widescreen Toho scope, Eastman color, and what was billed as three-dimensional magnetic stereophonic sound. For Japanese audiences, King Kong vs. Godzilla was really a salaryman comedy with giant monsters. Salaryman comedies being that singularly Japanese subgenre about its growing post-war white-collar workforce, which happened to be Toho's bread-and-butter movie genre. That film became the fourth highest-grossing movie in Japan that year, and the most popular Godzilla movie ever in terms of ticket sales, and it outgrossed such popular foreign films as 101 Dalmatians, El Cid, and Hatari. The success of that film really launched Godzilla as a bona fide movie franchise, and 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla, originally released in the United States as Godzilla vs. The Thing, and Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, were popular with mainstream audiences. By the time Invasion of Astro-Monster was released on Sunday, December 19, 1965, the audience flocking to Godzilla pictures was changing rapidly. As was the norm for Japanese movies of the 1960s, Invasion of Astro-Monster was part of a double bill that, in this case, included, as its co-feature, a film called Ereki no Wakadaisho, which translates roughly to Electric Guitar Young Guy, though Toho gave it the international title Young Beats. Like Invasion of Astro-Monster, Young Beats was the sixth film of its series, the hugely popular Wakadaisho movies starring actor, singer-songwriter Yuzo Kayama, who's best known in the West as the star of Kurosawa's Redbeard, and who played the leader of the young band of samurai in Sanjuro. The Wakadaisho movies were romantic musicals about a clean-cut college student whose extracurricular activities include sports like judo and skiing, and who in each film romanced wholesome Yuriko Hoshi, the pretty female lead of both Mothra vs. Godzilla and Ghidorah. These films were enormously popular with teenagers and university students who envied Wakadaisho's good looks, natural talent in sports and song, and who got to travel to exotic foreign countries that in the mid-60s were far beyond the reach of most Japanese. Here at long last, we hear the military march theme that had been cut by UPA from the main titles. Saperstein didn't seem to like the marches Ifukube wrote for these films. He also cut the march out of War of the Gargantuas. The pairing of Invasion of Astro-Monster with Young Beats strongly suggests that Toho was aware that its Godzilla movies were appealing to younger audiences. Indeed, the next Godzilla film, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, had as its co-feature a film starring Ghidorah's Yosuke Natsuki, whose very title was Korega Seishun Da, This is Youth. By the end of the 1960s, Godzilla's audience had become younger still, and the movies began being paired with cartoons and other films targeting children. For those old enough to have seen the original Godzilla movies at the drive-ins back in the 1960s, at children's matinees or on local television in the 70s, back in the days before cable television and VCRs, and before infomercials killed the airing of old movies on afternoon and late-night television, watching these strange monster movies from the other side of the world was a really big thrill. I fondly recall the excitement when, twice yearly, one local network affiliate would have its Japanese Giant Monsters Week, Monday through Friday, on its 4 o'clock movie. Can children and teenagers derive the same enjoyment from these movies that we once did? These films require a suspension of disbelief that was pretty easy to come by back then, especially through the eyes of a child. The photorealism obtainable today with CGI technology, a technology usually extravagantly overdone, was not the aim of the people who made Invasion of Astro-Monster. So to complain that the special effects don't look photorealistic is beside the point. The kaiju Eiga of Eiji Tsuburaya was, by design, bloodless spectacle, with the kind of eye-popping images, the flying saucers, the Battle of Planet X, the scenes of urban destruction, that was reasonably believable within the context of a Japanese genre film, yet also reassuringly unreal and even disconnected from reality. Though cities are pummeled, in the 1960s Godzillas, one never gets the sense of tens of thousands of people being crushed under all that rubble. CGI technology, by contrast, can make the total destruction of a big city alarmingly real, and this in turn, I think, greatly distracts from what these kinds of movies, the original 1954 Gojira being the exception, are all about. As I mentioned earlier, here we see Godzilla's eyeballs moving around as King Ghidorah licks his wounds. One of the best tributes to Haruo Nakajima's performance as Godzilla comes from Teruyoshi Nakano, who on Astro-Monster worked as Eiji Tsuburaya's assistant director. Inside the Godzilla suit, it's very dark, Nakano said, lonely and isolated. During the summertime, when it's very hot, it can become hell in there. But Mr. Nakajima always persevered. He acted underwater scenes in that suit, he was buried underground, he withstood pyrotechnic explosions, and through it all, he was always Godzilla. During the early 1970s, around the time the Americanized Monster Zero was playing drive-ins and the last new Godzilla movies for many years were being made in Japan, American curiosity about Japanese monster movies was beginning to pick up momentum. Partly this was spurred by the March 1975 issue of Famous Monsters of Filmland, a 100-page spectacular filled with tantalizing photographs from all manner of Japanese fantasy cinema, including many films not yet released in America. It also featured a reproduction of a representative Tsuburaya effects set, and this further fired the imagination of countless youngsters. Meanwhile, Ohio-based Greg Shoemaker and Chicago-based Ed Gajucheski edited two landmark publications, the Japanese Fantasy Film Journal and Japanese Giants, respectively, which included some of the first serious and scholarly examination of the genre in English. Their work in turn inspired others to follow in their footsteps, and by the late 1990s, several fanzines were in print, along with books about the history of the genre, national yearly conventions were held, and internet sites disseminated the latest news from abroad. Another facet of the 1960s films that really works is that you actually care and are interested in the human characters, who in turn sell the story. This incredible finale wouldn't really work if it were not for the fact that Glenn, Fuji, and Tetsuo have made us accept what's at stake in this big battle, the very fate of the Earth. It's also here that everything that's good about the classic Godzilla films comes into play and is so wonderfully integrated, almost like an orchestra with its various sections. Here, the blending of Eiji Tsuburaya's special effects mesh exceptionally well with Akira Ifukube's music and Ishiro Honda's first unit direction of the human actors. And though many fine monster movies were to come, Invasion of Astro-Monster is notable as the last Godzilla movie with special effects personally directed by Tsuburaya in a film supervised by Honda with music by Akira Ifukube.
What can I do?
Now we just have a vacation.
Not you, Glenn. You're flying
Don't
back
worry,
to
kids. Godzilla and Rodan are okay, and we'll be back for more exciting monster action in the years to come. For their help in preparing this commentary, I'd like to thank Steve Reifel, Oki Miyano, Janice Truting, Yukio Nishi, Ed Gajucheski, and Akira Ifukube scholar Jim Figursky, as well as the cast and crew of Invasion of Astro-Monster. Right down to the last man, baby. This is Stuart Galbraith. Thanks for listening.